He drives 40 minutes on a Saturday morning to look at a car he will not buy. He already knows this. The seller knows this too, probably. The car sits in a stranger's garage in a suburb outside Stuttgart, or Sacramento, or Slough. It doesn't matter. What matters is the garage light flickering on and the shape underneath the cotton cover, and the specific way his breathing changes before the cover comes off. He's 63 years old. He owns 4 cars. He does not need this one. He reaches out and touches the rear fender before anyone has said a word. That gesture is not about the car. It never was. To understand what is actually happening in that garage, you have to go back about 50 years. Not to any single moment, but to an entire atmosphere. The post-war Western world had made a specific promise to a specific generation. Work hard, stay loyal, and the good things will follow. For the children of the late 1940s and 1950s, that promise arrived wrapped in very particular packaging: suburban houses, television sets, and somewhere in the background, always slightly out of reach, the shape of a machine that seemed to belong to a different world entirely. The Porsche 911 was introduced in 1963. That year, a boy of 12 living in a mid-century tract house in Ohio or Coventry or Lyon might have seen it in a magazine his father brought home. Not a car magazine, a general interest magazine, because in that era, a new Porsche appearing in print was cultural news, not niche enthusiast content. The car looked like nothing else on any road he had ever seen. It came from West Germany, which itself carried a strange psychological charge in the early Cold War years, a place being deliberately rebuilt into something aspirational, something proof of recovery. The engineering felt like a statement: clean lines, rear-mounted engine, a kind of purposeful strangeness that a 12-year-old couldn't articulate but absolutely felt. He filed it somewhere. Children of that era were raised inside a particular emotional economy. Fathers who had lived through rationing and wartime did not discuss feelings as a category of importance. You showed love through provision. You showed strength through endurance. Emotional life was largely managed through objects and activities rather than conversation. A bicycle was not just a bicycle. A model kit assembled at a kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon was a form of connection that neither party would have named as such. Objects carried emotional weight because direct emotional expression often didn't. This is the first layer of what classic Porsche collecting is actually about. The car was encoded early, during a period of formation, inside an emotional register that the collector may never have fully examined. The 12-year-old who saw that 911 in a magazine didn't just admire engineering, he associated it with a horizon, with a version of adulthood that looked like freedom and mastery and escape from the specific constraints of the world he was living in. Then something interesting happened. He grew up, and the 1970s arrived. The 1970s were a psychological earthquake for this generation. The decade that had been promised as a continuation of post-war progress instead delivered stagflation, oil embargoes, Watergate, the tail end of Vietnam, and a general cultural mood that historians now describe as malaise. The institutions that had seemed permanent began to look fragile. The corporation that was supposed to reward loyalty started laying people off. The confidence that had defined the 1950s curdled into something more anxious. For young men entering their 20s and 30s during this period, the experience of watching certainty dissolve created a specific psychological residue, a hunger for things that held their value, things that were built to last, things that were, in the language of that era, real.
A 1973 Porsche 911 Carrera RS did not depreciate in the way a family saloon did. More importantly, it did not disappoint in the way institutions did. It performed exactly as promised every time, with a mechanical precision that felt almost moral in its reliability. Ownership was not available to most people, which added another layer, but aspiration was free. And aspiration deferred has a very particular psychological effect. It compounds. By the time this generation reached genuine financial stability, mid-1980s, early 1990s, the cars they had been watching from a distance for 20 years had acquired something that new cars simply cannot have. They had become artifacts of a specific emotional history. Buying a 1969 911S in 1989 was not nostalgia in the sentimental sense, it was a transaction with the past self. The man writing the check was, on some level, completing something the 12-year-old started. Psychologists who study collecting behavior often focus on the concept of personal fable, the private narrative a person constructs about who they are and what their life means. Objects become chapters in that narrative. They serve as external markers of an internal story. The serious Porsche collector is not simply preserving automotive history, though he may tell himself that. He is preserving a version of himself. The correct color combination on a 1974 Targa is not an aesthetic preference. It is a detail from a chapter he read a long time ago. And the specificity of it matters, because specificity is how memory holds meaning. Here is what most people misunderstand about this behavior. They see the money and assume the motivation is status. They see the storage units and the matching numbers documentation and the forum arguments about correct wheel specifications, and they diagnose it as obsession or excess or arrested development. These readings are not entirely wrong, but they miss the primary mechanism. The collecting is an attempt at coherence. A life contains many selves across many decades, and most of them are simply lost. The cars are a technology for recovering them. The reason he drives 40 minutes to look at a car he will not buy is not irrationality. It is practice. The ritual of evaluation, examining panel gaps, listening to the engine, reading the VIN plate, is a form of attention that the rest of modern life rarely demands. In that garage, for those 30 minutes, nothing else is happening. There is no ambient anxiety about the future, no fragmented attention pulled by a notification. There is only a machine and the accumulated knowledge required to understand it. This is what the collector is actually purchasing when he eventually does buy, not the object, but the state the object produces. That state has a name in psychological literature. It is called flow, complete absorption, the ratio of challenge to skill perfectly balanced. Porsche collectors, particularly those restoring rather than simply acquiring, describe the experience in language that sounds almost meditative. Hours disappear, the mind quiets. Problems that resist language suddenly seem manageable.
This is also why the community matters so much. Porsche clubs, concourse events, the early internet forums of the 1990s where men in their 40s typed long paragraphs about correct engine tin. These spaces offered something the broader culture had largely stopped providing, a context in which deep knowledge was valued, a room where expertise earned genuine respect. The post-war generation was raised to believe that mastery mattered. By the 1990s, much of professional life had moved toward management, toward abstraction, toward the coordination of other people's work rather than the direct exercise of skill. The garage became the place where mastery still meant something immediate and real. What looks from the outside like an expensive hobby is, from the inside, a complete psychological ecosystem. And here is the realization that changes everything. The car on the lift in that garage is not a car. It is a question the collector has been asking since he was 12 years old in the language available to him about what it means to understand something fully, to care for it faithfully, and to be, without performance, without audience, without explanation, completely and entirely himself. The Porsche is just what the question happens to look like.